Welcome to another Professor Pincushion. I'm Tova, and today I'm going to show you how to add trim to your collar. Adding a lovely detail like trim to the edges of your collar can add something extra special to your garments. I'm going to show you two different techniques so you can pick the one that suits you best. Adding trim is not just for children, but it can be a fun addition even for adult collars. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to do my first example with just half of a collar piece. So we're going to say if this was attached to my shirt, it would be the left side of the collar. Obviously your collar is going to look differently. You first need to decide where you want your lace to be. I'm going to say for my example, I just want my lace trim to be on this curved section here. Now the collar is made up of two parts. You have one part that's just the fabric, and then you have something that looks similar but it's the opposite, and this has the interfacing already attached. I'm going to take the one that doesn't have the interfacing on it yet, and I'm going to do a basting stitch on the area where I'm putting the trim at your seam allowance. So in my example, my seam allowance is a 1/2 inch. So on this curved edge, I'm just going to go in a 1/2 inch and do a basting stitch. When doing your basting stitch, you don't have to worry about doing any back stitching, and I would recommend using a contrasting thread color. This is just a temporary stitch to help us put on our trim, so you can eventually take this stitch out, which is why it's okay to use a contrasting color. Next, you're going to grab your trim, and you can see for my trim, it's actually very narrow. If I was just to put this on the edge, like you do with a lot of stuff, and then you sew your seam, you can see from my basting stitch, this falls outside of my seam allowance, so you're not going to see it. Even if you have trim that's wider than this, let's say it's twice as wide, you're only going to see the end of it once you finish sewing your seam. So what I do, this is why I do the basting stitch, is I line up the edge with that basting stitch, and you don't want it to be next to it. You want to put it actually right on top of it, so the straight edge is going right on top of that basting stitch. So then when I do sew my seam, I'm going to get right into that straight edge, and this is still going to stay free, and you're going to see the whole thing. Now, especially with this type of trim, it doesn't really fray, so I can just start this without doing anything to it and just start pinning it, because once I pin it, I can go ahead, go over the basting stitch again and baste it into place. So I'm going to go around this whole thing. But if you really don't want to have just a raw finished edge like this, you can go ahead, just turn it under a little bit, and then you can pin it to that. So I'm going to go ahead and pin it and then rebaste it into this area. At this point, my trim is basted on to where my seam allowance is on this collar, and I'm going to pretend like it's not even there because we're just going to move on to creating our collar as normal. So now I'm grabbing the matching piece with the interfacing. I'm going to pin it into place and stitch wherever you would normally stitch. You're going to have to consult your pattern directions for this. So for my directions, I'm doing a seam allowance here, my 1/2 inch seam allowance here. But when I'm sewing it at the machine, go ahead and look at the wrong side so you can still see your basting stitches, and you can make sure that you're sewing exactly on your line so we're catching our lace that's on the inside. So this is placed right side to right side, and then just take it to the machine and do a regular stitch. For this part, I'm doing a regular straight stitch, so it's just a regular length that you would normally use. And you want to make sure that you definitely do your back stitching. And I'm going very slowly because I want to make sure that I stitch right on top of my basting stitch. Normally after I stitch my seam, I like to trim my seam allowance and then cut inverted notches into all the curved areas. But before I do it for this time, I'm just quickly going to flip this right side out and inspect my trim to make sure that it's actually sewn into the seam and there's not any loose areas where it's not secured at the base. If it's okay, then I'm going to go ahead and put it wrong side out again, and I'm going to trim my seam allowance. So I'm leaving just a 1/4 inch of seam allowance all the way around, and then for any curved areas or corners I have, I'm going to cut up the corners, and then I'm going to cut off just cut in little inverted triangles, but be careful you don't cut into your stitches. Then you can flip it right side out and press it. Here's what it looks like when it's been trimmed, and it has the inverted notches. You can see I made sure I didn't cut into my stitches. So now I'm going to go ahead, flip it right side out, press it. And if you see any of your basting stitches on the right side of your collar, you can go ahead and remove those. Now you can see that I have my trim on the edge. So it's sewn in between the two layers of collar, and now I could take it to my machine and do a top stitch around the edge just to finish it and make it look nice. When sewing my top stitch, I have the interface side of the collar faced up, so I'm looking at the interface side. That's because that's how it's going to be when you're attaching it to your shirt. The interface side goes up. So I want to make sure that this is going to look as neat as possible. And you can see I'm going right along my fabric edge. So you want to get as close as you can without hitting your trim with your stitches. Now I'm going to show you a different way to add trim. And for this method, I think it works best if you're working with a flat trim as opposed to one that's pre-ruffled. I just think it ends up looking a little odd. So this collar is the same exact as my other collar, only I didn't do any basting stitch. I just took my interface side and the side that has no interfacing, and I stitched them together in my normal seam. I have the one with interfacing, which is this one, faced up, because this is going to be the right side when you attach it to your shirt. And for this one, it's actually faster once you get the hang of it, but it is a little tricky because you can't pin the trim ahead of time. It's really hard. So I don't want to have this raw edge here this time along, so I'm just going to fold it. And basically you're going to take it to your machine and you're going to butt up the trim with the edge of your seam. So you can see this is already right side out and I've already pressed it. And it's just going to go along the line, and you're going to get it as close as you can to the edge of your collar where you want it to be without overlapping it. And you can really only do that by just holding it in place as you're sewing it. And I'll show you what type of stitch to use for this. I'm switching the stitch on my machine to look like something like this, which sort of looks like a blanket stitch. So you have your straight edge and then you have stitches that come off that straight edge. The straight edge is going to go on the edge of our collar, and then as the stitches that come off it should catch the edge of our trim, and that's what's going to hold it on. You may have to play around with the stitch until you get the size that you want. I know from my experimenting, the length is okay, the width is a little big, so I'm going to go ahead and adjust this to a 4. For this, you may want to experiment on some scraps of fabric just so you can get the hang of it. So you can see the straight edge is on the edge of my collar, and then when it does the stitch outward, it's just grabbing the edge of my trim. So you just got to kind of hold it right against that edge to make sure that it's getting caught, and just take your time doing it. Here are the two different methods side by side so you can see the results. This is the one that I just did. And this way is definitely faster. This requires more prep time, but I think this way is probably a little bit more secure, since not only is it stitched actually into the seam, but then you have the top stitch securing it. So it's probably a little bit more resilient. Also, the nice thing about this one is that you only need to match your thread, your top stitch thread, to your collar piece. So if your collar and your trim is a different color, it's not that big of a deal. This one, if this was white and this is white, then you're not going to notice my stitching as much, but because it is two different colors, you're either stuck with just choosing one, or you're just going to have to use a contrasting thread to sort of make it a feature of your collar. New tutorials are released weekly, so please subscribe to be notified of the next release. Make sure to check out our other videos and visit ProfessorPincushion.com to view our complete library with well over 200 sewing video tutorials, including our exclusive premium content. Our premium membership is only $5 a month for unlimited access and only available at ProfessorPincushion.com. Also, don't forget to download our mobile app for videos on the go. Thanks for watching.